Good evening, boys and ghouls. Welcome back to the channel. I am D, your fervent footman on the funky floor of film fanaticism. As you can probably tell by our groovy backdrop, our journey through the history of horror has brought us to the 70s. Now, I usually say that we let the 70s get away with far too much, be it in terms of movies, music, fashion, what have you. Simply put, there's no other decade that's so in your face, so unabashedly gratuitous as this one. That said, the 70s marked the beginning of what's sometimes called the Bronze Age of cinema and spawned quite a few real heavy titles. This is, after all, the era of The Godfather, Star Wars, Apocalypse Now, A Clockwork Orange, and many more. And the horror genre got its fair share as well, as you're about to see. Now, to the list. The early 70s introduced a fear of the occult following the rise of early LaVeyan Satanism and the Charles Manson cult murders, a fear that would only grow into the full-blown satanic panic some 10 or so years later. Thus, there were a number of 70s horror films on the topic of devil worship and demonic possessions. The Omen is one of the more well-known. It's a grim and grainy movie with a bleak plot and a doomy musical score. Kinda what you'd expect for a story about the Antichrist, I suppose. The Omen is far from perfect. The pacing is a bit sluggish, and towards the end you've kinda had your fill. Also, there were some sequels, and yeah, it got old real quick. The first movie is good though. The atmosphere is on point, and there are some scenes that will linger in your head for weeks. The Abominable Dr. Phibes. Vincent Price is back, now in the role of a disfigured gentleman seeking revenge against the doctors that he deems guilty for the death of his wife. His weapons are bizarre traps inspired by the biblical plagues of Egypt, the probably most memorable of them being the strangling frog mask. I mean, points for creativity, I guess. This is an exceedingly theatrical and unrealistic movie, which seems to play right into the gaudy aesthetics of the disco era, but this could likely be entirely by choice. It's a tribute to the style of film popularized by Hammer Studios and Roger Corman, which was now in its waning years. The Abominable Dr. Phibes is quite a movie, a loving farewell to the retro-gothics of the previous decade. Carrie. With this, Brian De Palma managed to do something so near inconceivable as pleasing both moviegoers and fans of Stephen King. This tale of a bullied schoolgirl who eventually snaps and exacts bloody supernatural revenge helped popularizing several film tropes that we now take for granted. It's a bold movie, playing fast and loose with the free artistry of the time, and it came to be something of a genre standard for the latter half of the 70s. Most of the movie is merely build-up for the finale, but when the payoff comes, whoa, it doesn't hold back. The final scenes might be the only ones you really remember, but they sure earned it. Suspiria. Italian director Dario Argento had several international hits with his colorful visions and stark imagery. Suspiria might be his strongest piece. It's the story of a young dancer who is accepted into a school that happens to be run by a coven of witches. It is both disturbing and humorously exaggerated, with something of a post-expressionist feel to it. Nothing ever looks real per se, but the scenes stick in your mind in a way realism probably wouldn't have. With its pointy musical score and colors set to 11, it's the movie equivalent of a broadside to the senses. Stylistic as they come, and creepy to boot, Suspiria is horror turned art. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the movie that had the censors screaming bloody murder. Tobe Hooper's addition to the horror genre definitely helped push it towards the soon-to-be slasher territory, but it's not exactly what you might expect of a movie like this. For one thing, there's surprisingly little blood in it, and a lot less chainsaw violence than the title suggests. Instead, the story conveys helplessness and a sense of dread that becomes increasingly real as the movie progresses. Sure, there's both murders and chainsaws in there, but it's never a slaughterfest. Texas Chainsaw Massacre presents a nightmare that you always feel, maybe, it might just actually happen. In space, no one can hear you scream. Alien is a slasher movie that just so happened to take place in outer space, aboard a spaceship that is the equivalent of an interstellar trucking rig. The people here are just people. They're not scientists or military personnel, they're just ordinary workers who wind up in a situation far beyond their capabilities as they're infected with a murderous extraterrestrial parasite with a life cycle as fascinating as it is terrifying. The movie thrives on the feelings of solitude and the fear of the unknown, but it's also visually striking. Everything looks worn and used or has a flowing, organic feel to it, where the boundary between living and non-living is uncomfortably blurred. All this gives a masterful veneer of realism to a story that is otherwise quite out there. Alien is pure fantasy, and yet it feels so real. 10 years after his debut with Night of the Living Dead, George A. Romero returned to the zombie genre with an entirely new vision. Dawn of the Dead is in color and playfully wallows in gore and bile, but it also has a grim sense of humor and a distance awareness that the original lacked. For the most part, the movie takes place at a shopping mall, where a group of survivors barricade themselves from the ongoing undead apocalypse outside. They would have been fine there if it hadn't been for other people screwing it up. Most notably this douchebag, played by the legendary makeup artist Tom Savini, who also did makeup for this movie. The mall location is usually seen as social satire, likening the zombie plague to consumerism. Interpret it as you wish, Dawn of the Dead is still one hell of a movie.
We got this, man. We got this by the ass.
The Exorcist. It has been called the scariest movie of all time, and while I might not agree with that, I can still see why. It's the prime example of the rising fear of satanic influence, but in many ways it was also one of the catalysts for it. This was also the movie that turned the concept of the Ouija board into more than just a harmless parlor game. Max von Sydow plays the titular exorcist, but the most memorable actor is easily Linda Blair in the role of the possessed girl. And I don't want to brag or anything, but I got her autograph. The Exorcist might or might not be the scariest film ever, depending on your preferences, but it is unforgettable and well worth the number 3 spot on this list. This might well be the most recognizable and parodied movie poster in history. Jaws was the movie that made people scared of water and that rocketed Steven Spielberg to director stardom. The story is about a killer shark that attacks boats and swimmers indiscriminately. Eventually, a trio of hunters set out to put an end to the fishy terror, and that's when the movie begins in earnest. Jaws uses camera angles and music to build suspense in an absolutely brilliant way. The shark itself is seldom shown, which is just as good as the effects aren't really that impressive, to be honest. Instead, they build that suspense and spring the shark on you only when you least expect it. Jaws is one of those movies that, considering the times, just couldn't have been better made. Almost half a century later, it is still by far the best shark movie ever made. I remember Jaws scaring the hell out of me back when I was way too young to see it, really. Also, Jaws is one of only 4 movies on this list that have not had a modern era remake. The other being The Exorcist, Dr. Phibes and Alien, although I'm not sure what exactly is going on with the Alien franchise these days. And this is true also for the movie in the number 1 spot. It has been remade, rebooted, re-rebooted, and yeah. No honorable mentions this time, just straight to the top. Halloween. John Carpenter kicked off the slasher trend for real with this low-budget movie, a simple but effective film about an escaped murderer who attacks young people during a holiday when anyone is allowed to walk around wearing a mask. In the lead role we find Jamie Lee Curtis, daughter of Janet Leigh, who got herself into a stabby situation in a certain forerunner to this movie, and she dons the family colors with pride. She came to be known as the Scream Queen after this, cause she can holler like nobody's business. The movie also made popular the idea of the faceless killer, the masked threat who could very well be anyone. Halloween surpassed itself by miles on end. As mentioned, it spawned a ton of sequels and reboots and quickly turned into one of the most confusing franchises in horror history. Most of them suck, to be honest, but the original is a superb little movie that I myself return to about once a year, about this time. And that was my pick for the top 10 horror movies of the 70s. Next we move on to the towering monolith of a decade that is the 80s, and that's gonna be a lot of fun to plow through. Join me there as the journey continues. Thanks for watching, catch you on the flip side.